For 5,000 years, one civilization has dominated every conversation about death and preservation. Egypt, pharaohs wrapped in linen, organs sealed in canopic jars, bodies built to last forever. It is the story every textbook tells. The Egyptians perfected mummification. They invented it. But 7,000 kilometers south, in one of the driest places on Earth, a fishing community was doing it 2,000 years earlier. And DNA investigations now suggest their story rewrites everything we thought we knew about the relationship between humans and death. In 1917, a German archaeologist named Max Planck was surveying the coastline near the Chilean city of Arica. What he found in the sand wasn't pottery or tools. It was people. Dozens of preserved bodies buried along the shoreline. Carbon dating placed the oldest of them at 5050 BCE, 7,000 years old. That is nearly 2,000 years before the earliest known Egyptian mummy. And these weren't accidents of climate. They weren't bodies dried by the desert and forgotten. The Chinkoro people had deliberately disassembled, reconstructed, and painted these bodies. This was intentional. This was a technology. The site was the Atacama Desert coast, in what is now the far north of Chile, one of the driest places on Earth. And the deeper researchers dug, the more bodies they found. Over 300 Chinkoro mummies have been recovered so far. The first thing that separates Chinkoro mummification from Egypt is the technique. There wasn't one method, there were three. The earliest were the black mummies, dating to around 5000 BCE. The body was completely dismantled. Skin was removed, organs and muscle tissue were extracted. The skeleton was reinforced with wooden sticks bound together with plant fiber. Then the whole body was reassembled. Clay was molded over the frame to rebuild the shape of a person. A face was sculpted. Hair was reattached as a wig. The red mummies came later, around 3000 BCE. These were less invasive. Organs were removed through incisions rather than full dismemberment, and the simplest tradition was mud coating. The body was covered in a thick paste of sand and binding agents, then left to harden in the desert sun. Three distinct technologies, 3,500 years of evolution, and not one of them borrowed from Egypt. But the technique isn't even the biggest surprise. It is who they mummified. In Egypt, mummification was reserved for the elite, pharaohs, priests, nobility. Everyone else went into the ground. The Chinkoro mummified everyone, infants, children, the elderly, fishermen, women. There was no hierarchy of preservation. Some of the most elaborate mummification work was performed on the youngest. Babies who lived only days received the same treatment as adults who lived decades. And that is where DNA enters the story, because the question wasn't just when they mummified, it was who these people were. In 2022, a team led by Chilean and international researchers published the first comprehensive ancient genomic analysis of the Chinkoro population. They extracted DNA from bone fragments of mummified individuals spanning 3,000 years of Chinkoro history. The results pointed to a deeply rooted coastal South American population. These weren't migrants from the highlands. They weren't connected to the later Andean empires. The Chinkoro were fisherfolk. Their DNA shows they had lived along that narrow coastal strip for thousands of years before they ever began mummifying their dead. The genetic data showed remarkable continuity. The same population, the same lineages, living in the same place for millennia. But the DNA also opened a darker question, because the Chinkoro lived along the Cameroon's river valley, and that water carried something dangerous, naturally occurring arsenic, at concentrations far above safe levels, and it had been in the water for thousands of years. Chronic arsenic exposure causes miscarriages, stillbirths, infant mortality rates that would have been catastrophic for a small community. Some researchers now argue that the mummification tradition began as a response to grief. When so many children were dying, the community found a way to keep them present. The DNA evidence supports this. Genetic markers consistent with chronic arsenic exposure appear across multiple generations of Chinkoro remains. Not just preservation, not just ritual, possibly the world's oldest documented communal response to an environmental health crisis. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because the claim that the Chinkoro invented mummification depends entirely on what we mean by that word. There are naturally preserved bodies far older than 7,000 years. The dry caves of South America, the frozen tundra of Siberia, and the peat bogs of northern Europe all contain human remains older than the Chinkoro. The distinction is intentionality. The Chinkoro aren't the oldest preserved bodies. They're the oldest deliberately mummified ones. And that distinction matters enormously, because calling both processes mummification flattens a critical difference. Egyptian mummification aimed to preserve the individual identity forever, to defeat decay for eternity. The Chinkoro may have been doing something entirely different. The bodies were displayed, carried, repainted over generations. These weren't sealed away in tombs. They stayed with the living. DNA can tell us who these people were. It can map their ancestry, their health, their exposure to toxins. But it can't tell us why they chose to rebuild their dead into something that could stay. So what exactly was happening on that narrow strip of coastline? And what can the physical evidence tell us that the DNA can't? The black mummy technique is the most elaborate artificial mummification process ever documented, more complex than anything the Egyptians ever attempted. First, the skin was carefully removed in large sections. Then every organ was extracted. The brain was pulled from the skull. The skeleton was dried. Then wooden poles were inserted along the spine, through the arms, through the legs. Plant fiber bound the joints together. Clay was packed over the entire frame, shaped into the contours of a human body. Shoulders, chest, limbs, a face. Then the entire figure was painted black with manganese pigment, and the original skin was draped back over the clay form, creating a layered shell of human and sculpture. A wig of real human hair was attached to the scalp. The result was something that looked like a person, but wasn't one anymore. A reconstruction, a vessel. And here is the detail that changes the interpretation. Many of these black mummies show evidence of repeated repainting, new layers of manganese applied years or even decades after the original mummification. These bodies weren't sealed in tombs and forgotten. They were maintained, refreshed, kept in active use by the community. Some archaeologists believe the mummies were propped upright during gatherings, treated as present members of the community rather than departed ancestors. The UNESCO World Heritage Committee recognized the Chinkoro mummy sites in 2021. It was the first time a South American mummification tradition received that designation, but the recognition also accelerated excavation. And the new digs brought new DNA. Genomic analysis of Chinkoro individuals spanning from approximately 5,000 to 1,500 BCE showed something remarkable. Population stability. The same genetic signatures, the same mitochondrial lineages, the same Y chromosome markers. Across more than 3,000 years, the Chinkoro barely changed. They weren't part of the Great Highland Migration waves. They weren't connected to the populations that would eventually build Tiwanaku or the Inca Empire. They were a coastal people, genetically isolated, fishing the same waters, drinking the same poisoned river, and mummifying their dead for longer than most civilizations have existed. And throughout that entire period, their tool technology barely changed either. The same bone fish hooks, the same harpoon points, the same woven nets. The innovation wasn't in survival, it was in ritual. The one thing that changed and evolved was how they treated their dead, and the arsenic question kept returning. Isotopic analysis confirmed that Chinkoro communities consumed water with arsenic levels 10 to 100 times above modern safety limits. Skeletal analysis of Chinkoro infants shows rates of premature death far exceeding comparable ancient populations. One study estimated that as many as 1 in 4 pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. And when researchers plotted arsenic concentration against mummification rates, the correlation was striking. The periods with the highest arsenic exposure coincided with the most intensive mummification activity. The Cameroons Valley wasn't just where the Chinkoro lived, it was what shaped them, their genetics, their health, their relationship with death itself. And the mummification techniques themselves evolved in a pattern that DNA helped decode. Black mummies gave way to red gave way to mud-coated. Each generation simplified the process. Some researchers interpret this as skill loss. Others argue it was democratization. As the practice spread to more families, the complex black technique became impractical for a small community to maintain at scale. By about 1500 BCE, the Chinkoro mummification tradition had ended entirely. 3,500 years of continuous practice simply stopped, and the DNA tells us why. Around 2000 BCE, highland populations began moving toward the coast. New genetic markers appear in the Chinkoro record for the first time. Admixture, intermarriage, dilution. The people who had been genetically isolated for millennia were finally being absorbed. And with that absorption came new customs, new tools, new ways of handling the dead. The last Chinkoro mummies are the simplest, mud-coated, barely treated, as if the community itself was losing the reason to continue. So what does this change? What does it mean that the world's oldest deliberate mummification tradition came not from a powerful empire, but from a small fishing community on a poisoned river? It means the story we've told about mummification for centuries has been backwards. Egypt didn't invent the idea of preserving the dead. Egypt industrialized it. The Egyptian tradition emerged around 3200 BCE. By that point, the Chinkoro had already been mummifying their dead for nearly 2,000 years. And while the pharaohs mummified for power, the Chinkoro mummified for grief. While Egypt preserved kings, Chile preserved babies. The motivations weren't parallel, they were opposite. And there is a problem that DNA can't solve. The Chinkoro sites are disappearing. Urban expansion in Arica is destroying burial sites faster than archaeologists can excavate them. Construction projects regularly uncover Chinkoro remains. Most are reburied without study. Climate is another threat. Rising humidity levels along the Atacama coast are accelerating the decay of mummies that survived 7,000 years of dry desert air, which makes the DNA work urgent. Every sample extracted now is a data point that might not exist in 10 years. And the Chinkoro aren't alone. Deliberate mummification traditions have now been identified across South America, from the Andes to the Amazon. The Chinkoro are just the oldest and most elaborate. The question isn't whether the impulse to preserve the dead is universal. It clearly is. The question is whether it arose independently or whether there was a connection. DNA hasn't answered that yet, not fully. But what it has answered is this: the Chinkoro weren't a footnote. They weren't a curiosity. They were a genetically stable, environmentally poisoned, ritually sophisticated community that solved a problem no empire ever had to face. Too many children were dying, so they found a way to make the dead stay. And we only know this because of DNA, not because of pyramids or gold masks or royal tombs. Because someone thought to test a 7,000-year-old bone from a fishing village in Chile. The textbooks say Egypt invented mummification. The DNA says Chile did it 2,000 years earlier. And the real question isn't which civilization was first. It is why we keep telling ourselves the story of pharaohs, when the story of fisherfolk came first. If you've watched this far, you understand that history doesn't belong to the biggest empires. It belongs to whoever the evidence says was there first. Subscribe, because the next case file is already open, and the DNA keeps arriving from places the textbooks haven't caught up with yet. Sources for everything in this video are linked in the description below. Every claim cited, every study named. 7,000 years ago, a fishing community on a poisoned river decided that death didn't have to be the end. And nobody told them the Egyptians hadn't done it yet.